January 1944. England. The morning sky was the color of ash, a pale blur above the frozen airfields of East Anglia. Rows of silver bombers waited in silence, their wings glistening under frost, engines ticking with the cold. Mechanics moved quietly, breath fogging in the dim light, their tools echoing against metal. Beside them stood something new, sleek, low, and predatory. The P-51 Mustang. For months, Allied bombers had crossed into Germany without returning. Luftwaffe fighters had hunted them ruthlessly, cutting through formations over Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin. The men of the 8th Air Force knew the statistics too well. 1 in 5 might never make it home. But that morning, hope came in the form of a long-nosed fighter capable of going the distance. Pilots climbed into their Mustangs, engines roaring to life, propellers slicing through mist. The new escort fighters would follow the bombers deep into Germany, farther than any before. That mission would mark the beginning of the Luftwaffe's end. By mid-1943, the skies over Europe had become the deadliest battlefield of the war. The Allied bombing campaign, led by the U.S. 8th Air Force and Britain's Royal Air Force, aimed to cripple Nazi Germany's industrial heart. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and weapon plants. But it was a campaign waged at a devastating cost. In the daylight raids over the Reich, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew in massive formations, bristling with defensive guns. Yet even their heavy armor could not save them from the wrath of the Luftwaffe. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fu-190s struck from above and behind, diving at tremendous speed before peeling away into the clouds. Every raid meant dozens of bombers shredded in the sky, hundreds of airmen lost, and morale slowly eroding with every mission. The air war was brutal arithmetic. In October 1943, during the infamous raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, targets deep within Germany's industrial belt, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. Nearly 600 men were missing or dead. The surviving air crews returned with torn wings, bullet-riddled fuselages, and the memory of friends vanishing into burning clouds. It became painfully clear that the Allies faced a critical problem. Range. The fighters that escorted the bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, were powerful, but their fuel tanks couldn't take them far enough. Over occupied France and the Low Countries, they could shield the bombers. But once the formation pushed into the heart of Germany, the escorts had to turn back. That's when the Luftwaffe struck, confident, organized, and deadly. The Luftwaffe's air defense network was among the most advanced in the world. German radar picked up incoming formations as they crossed the channel, relaying data to command centers where interceptors were scrambled from airfields across northern Germany. The timing was precise. By the time American bombers reached their targets, waves of German fighters were already waiting. For the Allies, it was an unsustainable battle of endurance. General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, admitted privately that the loss rates were becoming intolerable. The idea of unescorted daylight precision bombing, once a proud doctrine, was turning into a slow-motion disaster. Without long-range escort fighters, the U.S. might lose its air offensive entirely. Meanwhile, deep in the design offices of the North American Aviation Company, an idea was taking shape. The P-51 Mustang, originally developed for Britain, had already impressed test pilots with its agility and speed. But it was a new engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, that transformed it into something extraordinary. Combined with a sleek aerodynamic airframe and drop tanks under its wings, the Mustang could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin. And back. By late 1943, the first Merlin-powered P-51Bs arrived in England. At first, the bomber crews saw them as another fighter in a long line of promises. But as the Mustang squadrons began flying deep escort missions, the results were undeniable. Bombers were coming home. Luftwaffe kill claims dropped. German pilots began to speak of the long-range American fighters with a new kind of respect and fear. In the offices of Luftwaffe High Command, the situation was growing dire. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and constant bombing of aircraft factories strained Germany's air defense to its limits. General Adolf Galland, the famed German ace, warned that the Allies' combination of bomber, strength, and long-range fighter escorts could soon destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. The tide was turning. But it wasn't just about machines. The Mustang represented a psychological shift in the war. For the first time, American airmen could go on the offensive without expecting annihilation. For the first time, the Luftwaffe realized that their homeland skies were no longer safe. The stage was set for one of the most decisive transformations in aerial warfare. And as winter deepened in early 1944, the P-51 Mustang would carry that transformation straight into the heart of Germany's skies. By the dawn of 1944, Germany's cities were burning. The Allied bombing offensive had grown into a relentless rhythm. Night and day, British and American aircraft thundered across the skies in waves that never seemed to stop. But inside Germany, the Luftwaffe still fought back with desperate skill. From the ground, civilians watched tracer rounds stitch the heavens, and black plumes of flak explode amid falling aircraft. It was a grim ballet of light and death that marked every night from Berlin to Cologne. Still, within the corridors of Allied command, victory in the air was far from certain. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, the Jagdwaffe, remained a formidable force. Veterans like Adolf Galland, Günter Rall, and Walter Nowotny continued to rack up kills at an alarming rate. Their aircraft, though increasingly outnumbered, were faster at altitude and deadly in capable hands. The key to breaking them lay not just in superior planes, but in wearing them down, destroying their bases, fuel lines, and, most crucially, their pilots. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, understood that control of the skies would decide everything that came next. The invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, was being planned in secret. Without air superiority, no landing craft, tank, or soldier could safely reach Normandy's beaches. The task of clearing the skies over Europe now fell squarely on the shoulders of the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces and their new escort fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could climb faster, dive steeper, and fly farther than any German fighter. Its long-range fuel tanks extended its reach deep into enemy territory, allowing it to escort bombers from England to Berlin, Leipzig, or even Munich. Missions once considered suicidal. The aircraft's sleek laminar flow wings reduced drag, and its .650 caliber Browning machine guns could shred a Bf 109 in seconds. But its true advantage wasn't only performance, it was endurance. A P-51 could stay with a bomber formation for 8 hours, circling protectively like a hawk. When Luftwaffe interceptors tried to attack, the Mustangs would dive out of the sun, tearing through German squadrons before they could regroup. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. American bomber crews, who had once prayed to see friendly fighters reappear on the horizon, now flew with the comfort of constant protection. Pilots spoke with pride of the little friends, the Mustangs weaving above them like guardian angels. Each successful mission built confidence, and each returning wave of bombers carried evidence that something fundamental had changed in the war's balance. By February 1944, this change began to take visible shape. Under the strategic leadership of General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force's fighters, a radical new doctrine emerged. Instead of tying the Mustangs strictly to bomber formations, Doolittle gave his pilots freedom to roam ahead, seeking out and destroying the Luftwaffe wherever they found it. The result was devastating. German airfields became hunting grounds. Fuel depots and hangars were strafed. Luftwaffe fighters trying to take off were caught in ambushes, their airstrips turned into graveyards of twisted metal. Within weeks, the Mustang had transformed from a defensive escort into a relentless predator, dismantling the Luftwaffe's infrastructure piece by piece. Inside the German High Command, panic spread. Reports flooded in. Entire squadrons wiped out. Veteran aces missing, fuel reserves dangerously low. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, warned that fuel shortages were already cutting training hours for new pilots to almost nothing. Inexperienced replacements, many barely out of flight school, were being thrown into combat against battle-hardened American aces. The difference showed immediately. Over Germany's industrial regions, the Ruhr, the Rhineland, and the skies of Saxony, young Luftwaffe pilots were slaughtered before they even saw their enemy. The once mighty German air defense system was collapsing under pressure it could no longer sustain. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, morale soared. The bomber crews who had once braced for massacre now watched P-51s streak past their windows, diving fearlessly into swarms of German fighters. The sound of the Mustang's Merlin engine became a song of survival, the sound of hope echoing through the European sky. In just a few short months, the P-51 had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. Victory in the air came at a cost, one that weighed heavily even on the victors. As the P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers deeper into Germany, the results on the ground became increasingly devastating. Entire cities, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, were reduced to ash and rubble. Allied bombing strategy, now protected by the range and power of the Mustang, shifted from precision strikes to total destruction of Germany's industrial heart. The morality of these bombings remains one of World War II's most debated legacies. To the Allied command, it was a grim necessity. Every factory destroyed, every rail yard bombed, every oil refinery obliterated, shortened the war and saved lives in the long run. To the German civilians below, it was a nightmare without end. Nights of firestorms, suffocating smoke, and shattered homes. The P-51 pilots often saw it from above. They watched the glow of burning cities flicker through cloud cover, their cockpits illuminated by the orange reflection of human suffering. Some felt pride, believing they were bringing an end to tyranny. Others felt doubt, haunted by what victory required. The air war had crossed into total war, and while the P-51 was a symbol of technological progress and tactical mastery, it was also a reminder that every advance in warfare carried with it an advance in destruction. The sky, once seen as a frontier of heroism, had become the stage of humanity's most devastating power. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was not only beaten in the air, it was broken in spirit. The few surviving German pilots lived in a state of exhaustion and despair. Many had no confidence in their leadership, no fuel for their aircraft, and no illusions of victory. Training schools had been decimated. New recruits were sent into combat with only a handful of flight hours, often in outdated aircraft, facing battle-hardened Allied pilots with years of experience. The Mustang's dominance was psychological as much as tactical. German radar operators would watch their screens light up with dozens of Allied formations, and even before a single bomb fell, morale collapsed. Ground crews abandoned positions at the sound of approaching engines. Civilians began calling the Allied fighters Death Angels. Reports from surviving Luftwaffe officers spoke of young pilots breaking down in tears before missions, knowing the odds of survival were nearly zero. The skies that had once been the symbol of German pride, of the Blitz, of the early conquests over Europe, had become a graveyard. In desperation, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring issued empty promises and impossible orders, demanding that his pilots fight to the last bullet. But even Göring, once the architect of air supremacy, privately admitted to his staff that the war in the air was lost. The P-51 Mustang had not just outflown the Luftwaffe, it had outlasted its will to fight. The Mustang's range had turned the tide of the air war, but soon it would do something even greater. It would open the door for the final assault on Hitler's Germany itself. The winter of 1945 arrived with a strange silence over Germany. It was not the calm of peace. It was the quiet left behind after exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's Reich, had become a shell of its former self. Its bases were battered, its pilots depleted, its machines scarce and starving for fuel. Yet above that desolation, the roar of Allied bombers still came. Louder, closer, unstoppable. In January, waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted from England, stretching across the frozen sky toward the heart of Germany. But this time, they were not alone. Sleek silver shapes flew beside them. Dipping through thin clouds, the P-51 Mustangs, guardians of the bomber stream, their long-range tanks gleaming in the pale light. From radar stations outside Berlin, German operators watched in dread. The screens pulsed with massive formations, over 1,200 bombers and 900 escort fighters, a scale unimaginable just a year before. When the alarm sirens wailed across the capital, it no longer signaled battle readiness. It marked the beginning of another nightmare. German fighter groups scrambled in desperation. The JG-300 and JG-301 squadrons climbed into the cold, their FW-190s shuddering as they struggled to reach altitude before the enemy arrived. But before they could form up, they were already under attack. Mustangs, faster, higher, and more coordinated, swept down in precise, predatory arcs. It was the climax of the air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe's formations dissolved in minutes. Dogfights erupted across the sky, but the imbalance was absolute. The Mustang's laminar wings cut effortlessly through the air. Its Merlin engines screamed with controlled fury. In one mission alone, Allied pilots claimed over 200 enemy aircraft destroyed, and lost fewer than 20 of their own. For the Luftwaffe, this was more than defeat. It was disintegration. Many of the downed aircraft were piloted by teenagers, hastily trained, flying on fumes. The once celebrated German aces who had survived from the early days of the war, men like Günter Rall, Erich Hartmann, and Walter Dahl, now flew knowing that they could not stem the tide. "We were being hunted," one pilot later recalled. "We no longer controlled the sky. We only died in it." By February 1945, Allied control of the air was so total that bombers no longer feared interception. They bombed in daylight, at will, across the entire Reich. The Mustang pilots began a new, merciless phase, hunting enemy aircraft on the ground, strafing airfields, trains, and convoys without resistance. When Berlin was first bombed in February 1945, the P-51s circled above the capital like sentinels, watching over the great steel swarm. The city burned again. Rail yards shattered, factories collapsed, smoke rising into the cold gray sky. Civilians huddled in ruins, powerless beneath the thunder of engines. In the chaos, one fact was undeniable. Germany could no longer defend itself. The Luftwaffe had been not just defeated, but erased as an effective fighting force. Hitler's promises of new miracle weapons, the Me-262 jets, the V-2 rockets, offered no salvation. The few Me-262s that did launch were ambushed by Mustangs during takeoff or landing. Even Göring himself, once boastful that no enemy bomb will ever fall on the Reich, now avoided his own airfields for fear of Allied attack. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer a weapon of war. It was a memory. The P-51 Mustang had done what years of strategic bombing alone could not achieve. It had crushed Germany's final defense, opening the skies for the invasion of its homeland. And as Allied troops crossed the Rhine, they looked up to see squadrons of Mustangs slicing through the clouds. Proof that the path to Berlin was no longer guarded by the Luftwaffe. The last hope of German air power had vanished. But the story of the Mustang's triumph was not yet complete. Its P-51 ultimate test would come in the heart of Germany itself. During the final months of fire and surrender, April 1945, Germany was collapsing. The once mighty Reich had become a scarred wasteland. Cities reduced to rubble, fuel depots burned out, railways shattered. Yet above the ruins, the war still roared. The last remnants of the Luftwaffe were throwing themselves into the air, not for victory, but for survival. At the edge of an airfield near Munich, a young pilot, barely 18, tightened his gloves inside a worn-out Bf-109. The engine sputtered, coughing on its last drops of fuel. Around him, half the aircraft lay silent, stripped for parts, abandoned in the mud. The order from Berlin was simple: fly, defend the Reich. But there was nothing left to defend. Overhead, the sky was already full. The P-51 Mustangs had arrived before dawn, their long shadows streaking across the horizon. They didn't need to wait for German fighters anymore. They sought them out. They prowled the airfields, catching planes as they tried to take off, ripping through them with .50 caliber fire. The air war had inverted completely. The hunter and hunted had changed places. From Leipzig to Dresden, Hamburg to Munich, Allied fighters ruled the skies with mathematical precision. The Mustangs flew in relays, ensuring continuous cover for bombers and ground forces alike. For the Luftwaffe, there were no safe altitudes, no hidden valleys, no forgotten corners of airspace. Even the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, Germany's supposed miracle weapon, could not change fate. Though faster than the P-51, their engines were fragile, their runways exposed. As soon as they took off, Mustangs pounced, attacking during the jet's weakest moments. The result was catastrophic. In 1 week alone, more than 140 Me-262s were destroyed, most before they ever reached combat altitude. In Berlin, Hermann Göring, once the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe, raged at his generals. He accused them of cowardice, treachery, failure. But in truth, the Luftwaffe had been starved long before it was defeated. Its supply lines were shattered. Its pilots were dead or captured. Its airfields had become open graves for aircraft that could no longer fly. Meanwhile, American and British bombers unleashed the final phase of destruction. Entire industrial belts, Ruhr, Kiel, Hamburg, Leipzig, were erased from the map. The P-51 Mustangs swept ahead of the bomber streams, clearing resistance with surgical strikes. They destroyed fuel trains, strafed convoys, and shredded any flak position that dared open fire. By mid-April, Allied reconnaissance flights reported the unthinkable. German skies were empty, not because the enemy had retreated, but because there were no fighters left to rise. Out of nearly 3,000 Luftwaffe aircraft once stationed across central Germany, fewer than 200 could still fly, and fewer than half had pilots to fly them. General Dwight D. Eisenhower summarized it best: "If I didn't have air supremacy, I wouldn't be here." For the crews of the P-51, however, victory carried its own weight. They had fought at high altitudes in freezing winds, witnessed firestorms over enemy cities, and watched entire bomber crews vanish in seconds. Many returned home heroes. Others never returned at all. By the war's end, The 8th Air Force alone had lost more than 26,000 airmen, yet its mission had rewritten the map of Europe. The P-51's long range had made it the key to every offensive after 1943, escorting bombers, striking ground targets, and crippling the enemy's infrastructure deep behind the front lines. It was, in many ways, the weapon that made victory possible without invasion by air, an invisible siege that starved the German war machine from above. But while the Allies celebrated, the aftermath revealed something darker, a glimpse of how total warfare had evolved. Cities weren't just battlefields anymore. They were targets of strategy, morale, and annihilation. The Mustang had brought a new kind of war, precise, relentless, and inescapable. And as Europe burned, the lesson was clear. He who controlled the air would control the future. In the summer of 1945, as victory celebrations filled the streets of London and New York, the world quietly entered a new era, one shaped by lessons learned in the thin, frozen air over Europe. The Luftwaffe's destruction was not only a military collapse, it was the end of an entire philosophy of air warfare. Before the Mustang, range had always been the constraint. Every fighter a prisoner of its own fuel tank. But the P-51 had shattered that boundary. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back again. It had transformed defense into domination. Historians later called it the long arm of Allied air power. It allowed the 8th Air Force to strike anywhere, anytime, with near impunity. The Mustang didn't just destroy enemy planes. It broke the Luftwaffe's spirit, its logistics, and its rhythm. Even German ace Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected commanders, admitted in post-war interviews, "The Mustang was the best all-around fighter of the war. The day it appeared, our defeat became inevitable." That inevitability extended far beyond 1945, the United States Army Air Forces emerged from the conflict with a doctrine centered on global reach, a concept impossible before the P-51. The lessons of escort range, endurance, and air control directly influenced the designs that followed. The F-86 Sabre, the B-47 Stratojet, and later, the intercontinental bombers of the Cold War. In the Mustang's silhouette lay the DNA of every aircraft that would define the 20th century's next wars. But amid the triumph, another story unfolded, one of transition. The propeller age was ending. In German laboratories and Allied research centers, jet engines roared to life. The Messerschmitt Me-262 had hinted at the future, though it arrived too late to save the Reich. Still, the P-51 stood as the final masterpiece of piston-engine warfare. The bridge between two worlds. Pilots who flew it spoke of its precision and grace, how it climbed effortlessly, turned like a thought, and carried them home when everything else failed. To the men who flew bombing runs over Leipzig, Frankfurt, and Berlin, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a guardian. When the first peace came, some airmen even wrote letters to the aircraft they'd flown, thanking them for bringing them back alive. In post-war years, thousands of P-51s were sold to Allied nations or scrapped for metal. Yet its legend only grew. In Korea, the Mustang returned briefly, strafing columns, supporting troops, still fighting even as jet aircraft began to dominate the skies. Its success had reshaped more than just tactics. It reshaped how nations thought about power itself. Air superiority was no longer an advantage. It was a necessity. The defeat of the Luftwaffe became a warning for every military planner of the future. Never lose control of the skies. In Germany, the devastation forced a reckoning. Ruined airfields, crushed aircraft factories, and silenced assembly lines marked the end of the Luftwaffe's dream. Yet from those ashes, engineers who once built Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would later contribute to global aviation. From the U.S. aerospace industry to early European jet programs. The technology race that followed World War II owed much to the desperation and brilliance forged in that final struggle. The P-51 Mustang itself became an icon of endurance, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of engineering unity. Born from an American frame and a British engine, it represented collaboration at its finest. When the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine met the North American design, it was as if two continents had combined their best ideas into one perfect shape. That cooperation would echo through history, forming the backbone of Western military alliances for decades. By the end of 1945, the world's maps were redrawn, the skies reclaimed, and the age of the Luftwaffe had ended. But the quiet hum of the Mustang still lived on. In museums, in films, in the hearts of those who once looked up and saw them glinting high above the clouds. The final tally of victory was not in aircraft destroyed or cities bombed, but in a new global order built upon the mastery of air and technology. The P-51 had not just helped win a war, it had helped define the peace that followed. And yet, in that peace, every silent airfield carried a memory of men, machines, and missions that turned the tide of history. Dawn over Europe. The guns are silent now. The air that once trembled with engines and explosions lies still. A vast, quiet sky stretching over the ruins of cities and the fields that had seen too much fire. For the men who fought beneath those clouds, victory carried a strange weight. They had witnessed the sky itself change, from a place of terror to a domain of freedom. The P-51 Mustang had not only escorted bombers or defeated fighters, it had redefined what was possible when courage met innovation. Before the Mustang, distance meant safety. The Luftwaffe could retreat behind the heart of Germany, beyond Allied reach. But when the Mustang arrived, there was no distance left to hide in. It was the embodiment of reach, the long hand of Allied resolve stretching across the continent. Its silhouette came to symbolize something larger than a weapon. It was speed shaped by science, strength refined by necessity, and grace built from the unity of nations. An American airframe, a British engine, and pilots from across the Allied world, all converging in one purpose: to bring the war to an end. For the Luftwaffe, its arrival marked the moment when hope turned to inevitability. For the Allies, it marked the moment when dreams of daylight victory finally became real. But the Mustang's true legacy lies not only in the wreckage it left behind, but in the horizon it opened ahead. It taught the world that mastery of the sky was mastery of the future. That technology, when guided by necessity and courage, could alter the course of history itself. Today, when a surviving P-51 takes flight at an air show, its engine still carries the echo of that age, the hum of freedom won at great cost. The pilots who watch from below are no longer at war, but the memory remains of cold mornings over Germany, of black smoke over the Ruhr, of endless blue horizons where men once fought not just for victory, but for the right to return home. And as the Mustang's shadow crosses the grass one last time, it reminds us, the sky has always belonged to those who dared to reach it.